Good evening, and welcome to this roundtable conversation hosted by the DNC Council on Environment and Climate Crisis. Tonight, we'll be talking about what's next in the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration for climate policy and priorities. I'm Michelle Deatrick, founder and national chair of the DNC Climate Crisis Council. I'm a proud union member, a climate activist, and policy analyst, and we have a packed, exciting hour ahead as we stream live to you. This evening, we're gathered from many places across the US and abroad. I'm speaking to you from Southeast Michigan, from the land of the Anishinaabe. Wherever you're watching from, thank you so much for being with us. We have a right to celebrate right now. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have won, and won decisively with over 76 million votes, more than any presidential candidate in history, with the highest voter turnout since 1900. Biden beat Trump by nearly 5 million votes and counting, a margin bigger than the population of 26 states together. The blue wall of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and my home state of Michigan has been rebuilt. We're looking good, if close, in Georgia and Arizona, all driven by a surge in voting by Black, Brown, Indigenous, and youth voters, by communities that are deeply impacted by climate and environmental justice issues. And the climate crisis didn't stop for the election. Wildfires, historic warmth, that traces sweat on my face. Well, it's almost 80 degrees here in Michigan in November. Record-breaking numbers of tropical storms, including one headed to lash the Florida coast right now. In other news, Trump on Monday removed the head of the program that produces the nation's national climate assessment. And Democratic control of the Senate for 2021 hangs in the balance, with two runoffs in a Georgia January 5th runoff election holding the key. So what comes next in the Biden administration? I'm really excited to be here with our amazing speakers tonight and to introduce these climate thought and action leaders, and just all around really smart people to think this through together. Tamara Toles is an advocate for people and planet and North America director of 350 Action, where she supports and is accountable to organizers and campaigners on the United States and Canada teams. A native New Yorker and environmentalist focused on equity, access, and community, Tamara develops capacity building programs and creates multimedia campaigns to dismantle privilege and increase opportunities for vulnerable populations to access healthy air, clean energy, and a toxic-free economy at the local, regional, and national level. As the leader of 350's programming in North America, she drives mission-critical work and organizational investments to build a multiracial, multi-generational climate movement that is capable of holding our leaders accountable to science and justice, a much-needed mission right now. Adrien Salazar is a climate justice advocate fighting for transformative and equitable climate policy solutions, food and land justice, and environmental justice. He is a senior campaign strategist at Demos, where he advances climate change policy that centers racial and economic equity. As a steering committee member of the New York Renews Coalition, he helped win the passage of the 2019 New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is awesome. He serves on the boards of the Sustainable Economies Law Center and the Filipino-American Coalition for Environmental Solidarity. He is also a Data for Progress Senior Fellow. And Ben Goloff is a senior campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity's Climate Law Institute. He organizes national campaigns to phase out toxic fossil fuel production and advance a just transition to 100% clean, renewable energy. Ben holds a Master's of Science in Environmental Governance from the University of Oxford and earned high honors in biology, environmental justice, and climate politics at Swarthmore College. His organizing and action research center on solidarity building across movements for climate, racial, and economic justice. And in case you're just joining us, this is the DNC Climate Council's Climate Agenda 2021 Roundtable, focusing on setting the climate agenda for 2021 in the context of the election outcome. On the council's Facebook page, facebook.com/DNC Climate, We'll be dropping relevant links into the comments as we go, and many will also be shared in the live stream. And that live stream, by the way, is accessible whether you're a Facebook person or not. So we're beginning with the roundtable speakers, taking a few minutes to share a little bit more information about their work and their organization. And I'd like to give a big welcome to Tamara, Toles, O'Loughlin. Tamara, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I am so thrilled to get into conversation with my colleagues and comrades in this work. We spent a lot of time together across a lot of computers on not enough coffee, trying to hash out what's actually happening behind policy. So I think it's a really cool moment when we get to spend time together, connecting on why it matters to everybody. We are in a moment where we can celebrate, which is a nice change. We did it. This is a period of change and challenge where the movement of movements for humanity and justice supported the largest voter turnout since the 1990s. And not just in spite of, but in favor of a vision for the future where clean and sustainable energy is part of the blueprint for community. Like, damn right, we did it. Extractive technology and infrastructure are no longer the terms of engagement as we try to work on issues for people and planet. It's time for us to start betting on ourselves. And I'm really excited to get into this conversation on how jobs, infrastructure, and human health combined with the best available technology for all of the above can really help us to deliver on all the promises that got that vote turned out. From day one, the president-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will have a real opportunity to be the architects of the future for the next generations. And as they build in accountability, make smart investments in our community, and end the free ride for polluters, they will inspire all of us to do the work that it will require. We're going to be moving from transitioning from fossil fuel dependence in all the ways that it has misaligned our government priorities. And there's no time like now to rebuild, repair, and reinvest. So in this crazy moment of compound crises and celebration, we are really facing a challenge to move forward. And it is my hope, and I know Ben and Adrien, that they are also, clear-eyed on the idea that we're going to have a race forward view of the systems that we're up against, and a real appetite for governance that looks at all of the people in order to build a climate agenda that we can live our lives in. So super excited to delve into that together.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the work you and 350 have done and are doing, and looking forward to your always perceptive, smart remarks this evening. I know I'm going to learn a lot from all of you. Adrien, you do such incredibly important work on food and land, environmental justice. Would you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing, and just go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm really honored to be here with these incredible comrades this evening, and with you and all of the viewers. As Michelle said, I work with an organization, Demos Action, that works on racial and economic justice. And we fight for a suite of issues like voting rights. We sued a couple people this election cycle, a couple states, and we do work on education policy and workers' issues. I work on our climate justice work. And I do this work because, for me, the climate crisis is a palpable issue. My family is impacted in the Philippines by typhoons every season. And we just saw one of the strongest typhoons, one of the strongest storms in history strike the Philippines again. And I grew up in California, where I have my sister and her family and my nieces and nephews being impacted by the smoke of these wildfires that have been turning the skies orange that we've seen in these incredible pictures. And I know that for millions of people across the country and many, many more around the world, the climate crisis is clear, it's present, and it's unignorable. And in our fight for solutions, whether it's the work that we've done in New York to pass one of the boldest climate laws in the country, or working with our movement allies to fight for a just and equitable Green New Deal, we have to recognize that the origins of this ecological crisis that we're in are white supremacy, colonialism, and extractive fossil fuel capitalism. It is the current crisis, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, when you have an emergency, when you have a catastrophe, if it happens to layer onto an existing a society with massive inequality, the impacts of that crisis are only going to exacerbate those inequalities. And that's what we see when we see the hurricanes battering the Gulf South. The poor and Black and brown communities and indigenous communities are the ones that are most harmed and have the most need in support for recovery. In the West with these fires and in cities that have been segregated by redlining, and you see communities that have multiple polluting facilities where people live with the impacts of toxic air quality being the same neighborhoods that experience intense heat waves over the summers. And so we know that the communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis are the communities that we need to invest in designing solutions, in building out what is possible for getting a hold of this crisis. And with the possibility of a new presidency, I think we saw, as you mentioned, Michelle, that people of color pushed Joe Biden over the edge in key states. Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities turned out and were the marginal difference that carried places like Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. And because of this, I think we have to let our leaders know in the next administration that they have a mandate to act on climate justice, and that communities of color, particularly, these are issues that are bread and butter issues for all of us who are being impacted. And when you see the polls, this is something that climate action is something that Black, brown communities support overwhelmingly. And so we have to hold this administration accountable to the promises that they made and make sure that we tackle racial justice and climate justice together.
Thank you so much, Adrien, and thank you so much for contextualizing this. Right, you cannot address climate change without addressing racial justice issues, and vice versa. And these are systemic problems and the long legacy of racism and injustice and inequity that concentrates the impacts of the climate crisis on certain communities. So I was going to ask Ben Goloff to also talk for a little while. I met Ben actually at the very beginning of the council's work when we were kicking off our national listening tour. And since then, I've been lucky enough to witness the incredible organizing work that he does at the Center for Biological Diversity. Ben, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And it's an incredible honor to be here. Your tireless work on the council has already been so impactful, and couldn't be more honored to be here with Tamara and Adrien and for all your incredible work in the movement. I'm a senior climate campaigner at the Center for Biological Diversity, and we seek to protect wildlife and people from corporations and special interests that are threats to us all. And in our climate program in particular, we're using law, we're using science, media, and organizing to get to the root of what's actually causing the climate emergency. And as Tamara and Adrien both spoke to, is also at the root cause of a huge part of our health, economic, racial justice crises. And that's fossil fuel production, right? That's dirty energy extraction that has been going on for decades, fueling the climate crisis. I think we're all pretty sober-eyed that there are enough fossil fuels already in production, in open fields and mines, to blow us way past the 1.5 degrees Celsius upper cap that scientists say we need to mind. And that's terrifying. And at the same time, you know, that's not the only problem here. Fossil fuels are also a health and justice disaster. as we've heard, from speakers already, they're disproportionately burdening low-income communities, Black and brown communities more than others. And so when we're looking at this moment of acute crisis where we have a respiratory pandemic that is, again, disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, now is the time to get serious about reining in fossil fuels and advancing a just transition that can protect communities, that can protect wildlife, and ultimately can protect the planet. I'm thinking about this especially here in Los Angeles. It's home to the largest urban oil field in the country. This is actually, I remember when Michelle was here, we tried to take a little detour to see the Inglewood oil field. It's really horrible. And unfortunately, this is well beyond Los Angeles. We have over 5 million Californians that live within a mile of a toxic oil well. Many of those wells are sort of uber toxic, fracking or other kinds of extreme extraction. And again, these are the communities that are being hardest hit by the current pandemic. And so as Biden ascends to the White House with a clear climate mandate, now is the time to end the era of fossil fuels and to do so in a way that prioritizes justice for communities that for so long have been least responsible for not only the climate crisis itself, but also the extractive industries driving the pollution in their neighborhoods. And the exciting thing is that voters brought Biden in with that climate mandate, right? We have polls saying that 60% of voters want to see a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. We have polls saying that by a 2-to-1 margin, voters see a transition from fossil fuels to renewables as something that will drive the creation of millions of good jobs. And Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, he ran on this idea that we can create millions of good jobs, can lift up communities while advancing climate solutions. And no matter who ends up controlling Congress, we know that Biden has a really strong pathway through executive action using existing law to enact transformational changes for climate justice. And we'll talk about that more later. But we really will need the whole of us providing wind at his sails to go forward, to not wait, not make any, not take any time to step up there and address these crises that are intersecting and that we have finally have a path towards addressing.
Thank you so much, Ben. I want to speak very briefly about some of the work of the DNC Climate Council. We're just over a year old, approved by the DNC in 2019. We are a permanent entity of the DNC, but we have our own elected officers. We launched the national listening tour that Ben and I spoke about. And what we learned on that listening tour, in part, was how much people across the country want the Democratic Party to step up and be the party of climate solutions. And it is wonderful to see, as Ben said, how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have run and won with a climate agenda and now have a climate mandate. And one of the goals of our current goals and objectives is working on establishing environmental caucuses in state Democratic parties across the country. There are 57 states and territories. 41 of them don't have any voice at the state Democratic Party level. So we'll be doing outreach in the new year along those lines. We've worked on the National Democratic Party platform with help from all the organizations on this call and 170 others, and had some successes, and also looking forward to helping to recruit and support the candidacies of people who are running on climate platforms. But I am excited. And be sure to hang on at the end of our conversation. We're going to be talking about some calls to action, and including how to help win those runoff elections in Georgia that, as you hear, are really important to climate legislation going forward. But I'm excited to turn now to our roundtable discussion. And so as we've talked about climate polls as a top issue for Democrats, and Joe Biden ran on climate and won. So I'm really interested in your insights into the election outcomes, especially as related to climate, environmental justice. did climate have an impact? And what lessons can we draw from this for future races? And I'm wondering if Tamara would start us off in this conversation.
Sure. I would say, as a part of the chorus of folks cajoling, pushing, advocating for a climate president, before we got to the moment where we had a nominee and now a vice president-elect and a president-elect who can carry us the last mile, all of that was contingent on the idea that the future requires a vision with real plans, with action that happens in Congress, at the Senate, and at the executive level, simultaneously to mobilize the largest amount of resources possible to respond to the crisis that we're facing, which is only compounded in the window of time since we focused on it. So in thinking through the role of environmental justice in this space, of environmental advocacy for clean water and health, for people and planet, for basic services and the right to live without being killed by virtue of your zip code. That kind of work became a focus of environmental organizing around a climate president for a reason. One, because we've spent over 100+ years doing this without the lens of people. That has not brought us any real gains that we can be proud of looking at what's ahead of us. And the smart money has been thinking for a long time about shifting financial flows, specifically because that is how you make power shift from one part of the work to another, and investments in environmental justice communities, making sure we have the appropriate data to address, to first identify the harm and then work really deeply in community to address it along the lines designed by those folks most impacted, who have plenty of expertise on the problems that they are facing. Those are the kinds of things that it was pretty easy to meet with the Biden campaign, the Biden camp, and all of the folks around them, because they were also clear that this is not 2009's conversation around what climate looks like. It has to be one where communities are put first and their ideas are put to work. So it's been really incredible to be in this moment and watch us move from a conversation around whether or not environmental justice communities will be recognized, whether they are indigenous or rural or poor and urban or all of the above, to a place where we're talking about $2 trillion in investments over 4 years, real representation by communities, an entire advisory board that will be focused on environmental justice. Like, these are things that did not come because we've been being harmed. They came because we finally have leadership that recognizes it. And so I do think that this is a unique moment for a conversation about what can happen. I'm super excited to have an executive, one that reads, two that understands this work larger than an ideological space and recognizes that the power of the executive to inspire people, put them back to work, and give them careers worth fighting for in an economy that is not killing them. That's everybody's business. We could just call it environmental justice if that makes it easier for folks. But I think the time has come, and I'm super glad that we're all here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, can I add here? I totally agree with you, Tamara, and that we are where we are today because of the decades of work of social movements leading up to this moment, and really like the struggle against fossil fuel capitalism that began since settlers stepped onto this country, this land that we now call the United States, and displaced indigenous people and committed genocide in order to appropriate the resources of these lands in order to fuel the creation of this country. And where the results of the election that we have just seen, where climate justice is a central issue, is the result of the work of our movements. I really, since last week, cannot emphasize enough. I've been saying it every day. Like, we did this. We won this election. Not only did communities of color tip Biden over the edge in these key states like Arizona and Pennsylvania, we are organizing. The organizing of young people and environmental justice leaders really shifted the debate. And we saw climate being discussed at a level that it hasn't been for years, taken seriously. The candidates all started putting out climate plans that fleshed out a vision of specificity, like Tamara talked about, And it was through the organizing, even of you, Michelle, and other members of the party creating this space, the DNC Council on Climate, pushing the Democratic Party to take leadership, to really own leadership of addressing the climate crisis, that I think we've seen now. Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden, and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris say publicly that this is one of the first issues they're going to come out swinging out of the gates. And I really stress that these folks would not have done it by themselves. This is, as Tamara said, the trajectory of our movements of our political leadership has been failure on this issue for many, many years. And it is because of the momentum that folks built, really underscoring and making unignorable the facts of climate science, the reality of people whose lives are being disrupted today, who are swimming in floodwaters in Louisiana and in the Midwest, and breathing smoke in all across the West from these fires. It is because of us that we now have positioned the next administration to prioritize climate action. And I think we have to continue to beat that drum as we go into 2021. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, what are some of the actions an administration can take. But I really want to just underscore that it was no accident. It was no accident that the climate crisis became one of the critical issues of this election cycle, because the crisis is happening now, and our communities said, you must address this. And we did not back down. And I think that is the energy we need to bring into the next administration.
Absolutely. Underscore. Thank you. So in terms of what the Biden-Harris administration will be able to do next, there's a couple different scenarios, as you know. If we can win the two runoffs for those seats in Georgia, the Senate will be at 50-50 with then Vice President Harris as the tie-breaking vote. And that will also mean that Chuck Schumer is in charge of setting the agenda for the Senate, which is huge. So what difference will it make, do you think, if we win those Senate seats or if we don't? And go ahead and dive into whether we win them or not. What can we go forward with? We've already talked a little bit about executive actions and regulatory changes, but go ahead and let's explore that. I'm going to ask Ben to kick that off for us.
Sure thing, thanks. And I'm sure this is a question on many of our minds. And so, I'll start by saying there is no question if the Democrats control the Senate, we have a pathway to enact critical pieces of the Green New Deal that we just don't have without the Senate, right? And especially I'm talking about the Senate has power of the purse, the Congress has the power of the purse. So anything where we're looking about investing in communities, and this is the theme of today so far, right? It's like investing in Black and Brown communities and youth, in the indigenous communities that are actually, for the immediate term, have gotten Biden a ticket to the White House, but for the longest term are again, the bedrock of this country and the ability to organize for justice and advance in all of our futures, right? So to actually invest in communities on the big scale that we need in the Green New Deal, we need the Senate. And so absolutely, putting on my Center Action Fund hat, we all need to go all in to try to win those Georgia seats. But in general, and I'll just flag, a few specific actions that Biden has committed to, phasing out or immediately ending fossil fuel subsidies, ensuring a just transition for workers impacted, facilitating the build out of really dramatically scaling up renewable energy in a democratic way. All of that, we're going to need ultimately Congress to be a part of it. But the thing is, and I think a lot of people don't think about this, is that fossil fuel companies, fossil fuel executives have a leg up when we're laser focused on Congress and we're not looking at existing law. This country has some incredible, powerful law that has been the model for the world on environmental regulations, on wildlife, on protecting people and planet. And there is a ton of work to do using existing law starting on day one that's not just defense. It's not just about rollbacks. It's also about ensuring a transformational shift towards climate justice. And so we'll talk about that. But I would just say that for Congress, even if we, in the rosy situation, if the Democrats have the Senate, there will be intense pressure from fossil fuel lobbyists, from fossil fuel representatives to water down any science-based climate policy proposal. And you can probably think of some moderates in the, in either house of Congress that are not going to be ready to go for a science-based approach. That doesn't mean that they can't shift and that we're not pulling the tide that direction. But regardless of what happens in Congress, we have our work cut out for us, and we have actions we can take starting on day one in the White House.
Thanks, Ben. Tamara, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to flag that, like, let's spend half a second in the dream where we get the 50-50 and Kamala as the tiebreaker. I just want to flag that as a New Yorker, I'm not the only one on this call. Senator Schumer, as majority leader, worst things could happen. Just looking back at a little bit, worse things could happen. I think it would look like calling up bills that respond to calls for jobs, infrastructure, and human health. That stuff we pay for anyway, no matter what we call it when it's politicized. A real stimulus in support of people and not polluters that could be negotiated with Nancy Pelosi. I like the idea that we could have states support for states that are fighting climate change and COVID at the same time, because it's bankrupting our cities. That's happening in real time. Like having folks who are not interested in fighting and are instead focused on what the power of the purse could do would be really amazing. Recognizing that there's been part of why we got stuck in not getting the stimulus that people need to survive. People are basically living out of doors is because of sneaky things like pushing for liability waivers so everybody could catch COVID while they're trying to pretend that everything is normal. As we crash into this third wave, recognizing that real leadership in the Senate could help us to avoid some of that would be great. Thinking about the really great framing that has come from the Thrive resolution, the Green New Deal for transportation, the idea that green banking isn't just adding up two words to make them sound nice. It's actually about funding the future and moving money from polluters who've been held accountable into communities that have lots of ideas about how to solve problems. So that's the view of what it looks like if we're able to get what we want. If we don't, there are a ton of other things that we can in fact do. Joe Biden can convene the globe and say, we're back, meaning that we're really sorry. We shouldn't have done 99% of what has gone on to date. And we recognize that climate will not be fixed just by the US, even though we have a big role in it. So it'd be really amazing to have a climate world summit that puts the targets in front of us on the table so that we don't have to die on a fiery gas ball on our watch, right? That would be really great. Other things that could happen is cutting emissions through executive order, pushing the power of government to stop being the biggest user of fossil fuels through all kinds of methodologies that most people don't realize our dollars are paying for. So just doing things that we don't see on top of things that we do see, like new financial regulations to disclose what climate actually costs us. Those are the kinds of things that the president could do with the power of a pen that have nothing to do with whether or not there's agreement from the other branches. I think between reversing energy rollbacks, particularly I'm looking at the March 2017 order calling on every federal agency to dismantle climate policies and to and subsequent orders to stop raising up the importance of environmental justice across the federal government. So just undoing some stuff would do a lot to get us on the pathway to success. I know for a fact that Adrien and Ben have been thinking a lot about this, but in weighing over the last 3 days felt like 17 weeks of what it would look like. It's become really clear that there's action that can be taken no matter which way we go. It would be preferable to do deeper work sooner, but at this point, we've already started on the road to actually making change.
Absolutely. And I think we can win those Georgia seats. So I'm going to think optimistically, but plan for the worst. Adrien, I was wondering if you could dive into some of these possible executive actions and regulatory changes a little deeper. Maybe starting with what could happen on day one, January 20th, and then going forward.
Yeah, And I'll just plug here that there are a couple of resources that our organizations have worked on. And one is the Climate President Plan that the Center for Biological Diversity led on, and hundreds of organizations supported, that lay out a vision for what Joe Biden can do, the next administration can do immediately within legal authority. And Ben can talk more in detail about some of these things, but they include stopping the pipelines that have been, on and off again fight, like Keystone XL and Line 3 and the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so these are things that he can do with the pen immediately on day one. There's potential for him to declare a national climate emergency, which not only, I think, symbolically sends a signal to the world how seriously this administration will take the climate crisis. It also opens up special powers that he'll have in order to be able to do things like move some of the expenditures around from the defense budget into mobilizing a transition off of fossil fuels and injecting that into large-scale renewable development. There are many other things in that platform that I hope Ben will talk about in a second. There's another document that we worked on with over 100 signatories, 120 signatories, called the Frontlines Climate Justice Executive Action Platform. And in this, we really talked to a lot of our frontline partners who work with Indigenous communities, who work in communities of color, and fleshed out what are some of the things that an administration can do that address environmental justice right away and make sure that we're dealing with the overlapping crises of racial and economic inequality, as well as the climate crisis. And there are some very basic things in there that folks have been fighting for years, like respecting Indigenous sovereignty and making sure the next administration adheres to free, prior, and informed consent. That alone, if you see all of these fossil fuel infrastructure development projects that are going through Indigenous lands and territories, if the government actually respected the will of these sovereign nations, then that would help stop many of these projects. So there's that. There is fighting, putting in place regulatory rulemakings that would address the concentration of pollution in communities, what we call pollution hotspots, and making sure that we break up or set up standards so that we no longer allow the siting of multiple polluting facilities within a certain area, so that those communities aren't facing cumulative impacts of multiple sources of pollution. And there's some pieces that Biden has committed to in his plans, like doing an equity assessment and mapping of the country so that we can identify where are the communities that are most vulnerable to climate crisis and pollution, and then use that data to figure out where do we direct resources, which communities do we need to protect, which communities do we need to guarantee development of our renewable energy economy so that they have jobs and that people can live a good life instead of living with pollution and heat waves and droughts in their communities. So these are all sets of tools that Biden can implement as soon as he's in office. And some of these things he's already publicly committed to, and we just have to hold him accountable to getting it done.
Awesome, thank you.
I just want to add super quickly before you see a large cane that extends from 350's headquarters around my neck, the 350 Action headquarters, and just flag that Joe Biden already committed to ending KXL forever. So just want to make sure that on the very top of our list of like pipe dreams that we need to shut down super quickly, we're focused on KXL and the lattice work of fossil fuel infrastructure that it represents. So just wanted to get that out before the cane got me.
I wanted to mention more people have joined us. So you are on Climate Agenda 2021 Roundtable with the DNC Climate Council hosting. And I'm hoping that Ben Goloff from the Center for Biological Diversity, will talk a little bit about some of the incredible work that he's been leading on regulatory and executive actions and what we can do no matter how the Georgia races go. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks, Michelle, and huge thanks, Adrien and Tamara, for being incredible, brilliant minds in developing so much of this work. And I would just flag a couple things. I think, first of all, to your point, Tamara, there's a great deal of this that Biden has already committed to and that Biden has signed up for, right? It's on his website that on day one, he will end federal leasing for new fossil fuel projects on public lands and waters. On day one, it's there. We are thrilled that he's committed that. He's not alone. All the major presidential candidates on the Democratic side committed to take that action. So that's one of the ones that we're watching as something that we're very ready to celebrate on the other side. Because again, the root cause of climate injustice is fossil fuel extraction and, of course, the underlying racial capitalism that has led to that. So I would just flag that as another one to put up there with killing Keystone XL. Creating a climate justice screening tool. And I would also lift up fossil fuel subsidies. This came up later in the campaign as well as something that Biden has very clearly committed to take action on. And there's pieces of that he can do through executive action, and there's pieces of that he'll need to work with Congress to do. But thank you, Adrien, for lifting up some of the key parts of the Climate President platform, which again has support from over 500 groups across the country, and many of you are probably on this call, and we thank you for your collaboration. This is a team effort, and if you're not yet on Climate President, please do join us. But we're building this together. This is about building the bigger we and about building a big tent. And I want to come back down from the policy weeds to why does this stuff actually matter, right? The executive action is about implementing existing law, and the existing laws that are in place are about our families, our communities, our ability to breathe. I'm in Los Angeles again, within a couple miles, there are active oil wells, and there is no law here in California restricting where a community, where a household is living in relation to that oil well. But even, looking a little bit more broadly here in California, no new leasing on public lands matters because the Trump administration right now is trying to sell off new leases for the first time in years in the Bakersfield planning region of the BLM. And so this is, wherever you are, you can get the real stories, the real experiences of where that stroke of the pen actually hits home. And the other point I want to emphasize is that this is not about some radical unleashing of new executive powers. I think a lot of people hear executive action, they get a little freaked out. We've been through some rough 4 years, right? And we've been through some pretty phony declarations of climate emergencies. But what is more of an emergency than the climate crisis, right? This is the most devastating crisis we've ever faced. And it intersects with the racial, economic, and all the other justice crises that we've been facing. And so if there ever is a time it's not about creating, phony new law. This is about implementing bedrock laws that haven't been followed through on, that hasn't been the political will to implement to their fullest, that are already on the books. Think about the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act. These are time-tested laws that have been defended and implemented based on, the legal challenges and everything else, and they have prevailed because they are foundational. And many of them were enacted in a Republican presidency. So this is a time to be bold and to be true to the law and to be true to the science and justice underneath them.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Trump has approaching 125 rollbacks, right, of some of our key environmental and climate and environmental justice protections. So just undoing that is going to get us a long ways, but obviously not nearly far enough. The status quo isn't good enough. We have a question from one of our viewers. Jerome in Virginia is asking if we should institute a climate change office in the White House, what that would mean for the EPA, which kind of brings up is a really great question and brings up a broader issue. If you were going to recommend an organizational change, which is something that's in the purview of our future president, what would that be? What would that look like? Anyone want to jump into take that one? Tamara, I think you're muted.
Yeah, do we need to have an office that focuses on climate change in the White House? Yeah, as long as we're going to need air to breathe and water to drink, and bears are not going to solve climate change for us, we should definitely make it a priority, because there's not a single educational item that can matter. There's not a piece of infrastructure that can be built. There's not a dollar that can flow through the government that would be more valuable than one that's dedicated to getting us past survival to a place where we could actually thrive, and does that for the largest number of people. I think it's a sign of respect for the work that has come in to raise this up amongst other priorities in the movement, but I also think it's sound policy. You can't shift the people's money away from fossil fuels into a new economy unless you make the premises for that a public matter for discussion. Given that the Biden administration, even in its electoral election days, has already laid out a few different platforms for what it wants to focus on, and a focus on transparency. There's no better way to be transparent about how we're going to get ourselves out of the climate crisis than to devote the resources of the government to focusing on it as an issue, and looking at the lens of all the other things that can be resolved once we take on that lens. So I think it's a capital idea. I think it's late in coming, given the scale of the crisis that we are in. It is the only next best move that we can make to show real investments and a commitment to this to get us through the climate decade.
Climate touches everything. Yeah.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Adrien or Ben?
Yeah, I totally agree with Tamara, and that if Biden commits to creating an office dedicated to addressing the climate crisis, some folks have talked about an office of climate mobilization, call it whatever you will, it will both send a signal that this administration is taking this crisis seriously. We saw, even though Trump's administration put together a coronavirus task force that was basically a farce, we see Joe Biden already committing his own task force to addressing this very acute crisis that continues with respect to this pandemic. And he, I think, can do a lot by making the same signals with the climate crisis, by saying, I'm going to create an office within the White House, or move around some of these agency agency powers in order to have a set of body that has intersectional cross-agency oversight that can make recommendations, because, like Tamara said, the climate crisis touches everything. So we need an office that will be able to make recommendations not only to the EPA, but to the USDA, the HUD, to the FEMA, to the Department of Commerce, and all of these agencies. So I think that a climate office and a climate czar, as the papers like to call them, is going to be called for.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, I would say absolutely any signal that the Biden administration is going to take coordination across all levers of the government to address the climate emergency is welcome. And, our future is actually going to hinge on the ability and agility of the executive branch in this scenario, where that's the only lever, to oversee a science and justice-based transformation off fossil fuels to democratic, clean, renewable energy. And to the extent that, creating a new agency actually detracts from actually taking the immediate actions that we already have at our disposal, that's not great. But if it's an opportunity to converge and to coordinate across the levers as they're going from day one, then absolutely bring it on.
So something we hear a lot lately, and this is a nice segue from what we've been talking about, is people equals policy, or personnel equals policy. People are referring to the appointments that the future President Biden will be making at the cabinet level, Secretary of Energy, head of EPA, but also the other 5,000 some political appointments at mid and upper staff levels. So how important do you see these appointments as being, and are there any key ones that we should really be looking at and seeing how they're going?
I'll jump in and say, heck yeah, only because there are kids in the nearby. Largely because it takes 66 people to run the White House. So I just want to flag that, like, also a place where federal employees are given that we have a severe deficit and a series of agencies that have been gutted over the last 4 years. We have so much repair work to do that we have to have people who understand these issues, who recognize where the pain points are, who can triage and prioritize, like climate is everyone's business. So that means we're going to need folks in Bureau of Land Management, Office of Management and Budget, the GSA, for good's sake. We're going to need people, yes, in jobs and EPA, but we're also going to need people at HUD and FEMA, because everything related to the climate crisis creates emergencies, and those agencies have been gutted so intensely. So I just want to flag that, like, while there are top level appointments, we really need to be focused on all those other jobs. Labor secretary, like, we're in a crisis of not just jobs, not just careers, but of people's ability to solve basic problems. Like, we don't have people at NOAA. We don't have folks working in partnership with the USDA and Department of Agriculture. We don't have a State Department that hasn't been gutted by the current administration. So I just think that it is not an understatement to say that people and personnel equal policy. We need to have folks who understand these issues, not just folks who have done a good job in their last turn, but people who are really close to what communities have asked for, the policies that they have designed, the regulatory and participatory models they are already engaging in, and who get that this is no longer a command and control request for governance, but a participatory model that takes the people's expertise into account. And that can't just happen if the revolving door of Washington, D.C. Fills in folks who are rank and file. It has to have visionaries, it has to have architects, and it has to be really chock full of implementers who are neither, well, I mean, some of them could be sexy. I don't want to, throw a dragnet over people and say, you can't be a sexy implementer. I would be happy to meet that person, but we're going to need a whole lot of unsexy implementers to get this stuff done. And so that we need to fill every one of these spaces with people who get it.
Thank you. Adrien, looks like you might want to add something. Yeah.
I was just so excited what Tamara was saying. I was just feeling it, and I totally agree. I think the thing that maybe some of the folks who are watching now don't know is that there are going to be thousands of jobs that need to be filled. And these are, many of them are political appointments below the secretary and undersecretary level. And we want our people in those positions. We want people who understand the climate crisis. We want scientists. We want environmental justice experts. We want people who have been a part of communities on the grassroots fighting for climate justice to fill those positions. And so I think more than just floating a few names here and there about who should head the EPA and who should be the Secretary of Interior, we need to be thinking and organizing in our movements to put in place allies who are going to be doing the work, the difficult work that Tamara was saying, was laying out of rebuilding these agencies and then implementing the policies that we want to see put in place, and including the existing law that Ben keeps referring to, like getting the government to do its job, getting these agencies to regulate using the existing regulation and rebuilding the regulation that Trump has torn down, right? And so I think we really want to make sure that we have all of the right people in those thousands of positions. And I think this is an opportunity for our movements to be vocal about owning our power. Like I mentioned in the beginning, like we are powerful in this moment. We are powerful after this election, and we are powerful moving forward into 2021. Don't let anybody fool you. Don't let Republicans or anyone say that we are losing. We are winning right now. And I think what we need to do is ride that victory into the White House. And we need to be pushing the kind of people into the positions, letting the transition teams and all of the people who are making these decisions know this is the quality of people we need. These are the experts that we need. And some of these people need to be us. And we need to put our names forward, and we need to put our friends' names forward.
Absolutely. I just love talking with all of you, and I'm sad that the hour is already starting to come to a close.
Nerds of a feather.
I've got, sorry?
Nerds of a feather.
I wanted to bring up one more question from a viewer. We had a lot of questions around the agriculture sector from people saying, what can we do in agriculture? It often gets ignored. We don't think hard enough, and it's a major contributor to emissions. A specific one has been a couple around carcinogenic ingredients in our food, and what could a Biden administration do? And I wonder if one of you would like to briefly address that, since we're coming to the end of the hour. Tamara, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to take off my 350 action hat where we eat food, but we don't talk about it. And put on my Women's Voices for the Earth chair hat and talk about poison and how poison by any other name is still poison. Poison under administration that takes off all the safeguards that people fought and died for. Poison that happens under a lack of regulatory framing and no enforcement is really a big problem. A lack of understanding of the power of regenerative agriculture, of husbandry and stewardship that really takes into account that what happens to the planet is also happening to people and vice versa. It does not take a lot of thinking to recognize that if we're not making smart decisions about who is watching our food supply, who cares about our systems, who recognizes that food is being grown in urban and rural environments, and they are both subject to attack by basic failures of our regulatory environment for clean air, clean water, and restorative practice. Like, you don't have to be Jimmy Carter to like peanuts and recognize that, like, you can change the profile of soil if you care about it. We are not making investments in the future when we don't invest in our food supply, and there are certainly a lot to be done there. So the head of agriculture is as important a decision to be made about the future health of the next generation at the epigenetic level, like not just my body, but what happens to my genes that determines that happens to the next generation. That comes from food. So even though I don't often talk about that in the end fossil fuels conversation that we have, I do think it's important for us to be super clear that we cannot have a conversation about where we're going to be if we don't have a conversation about where we are and what seeds we're quite literally planting today by failing to do our jobs.
Thank you. And I think Adrien might want to add one more thing.
Yeah, quickly, because I know we're out of time. Yes, to regenerative agriculture, we need to invest in practices that are not just extracting from the soil, but that are actually rebuilding the soil. And these practices can help us address the climate crisis. We can support farmers in doing so. And at the same time, we need to think about how our investment in agriculture can also be reparative, because we have an agricultural system that has been built on the backs, literally, of Black people in this country. And you have a USDA that has been found in court to illegally discriminate against Black and brown people in its programs, and has been forced by court order to ameliorate that that discrimination. And so we have a deeply broken and racist agricultural system in this country. And when we talk about addressing the climate crisis by rebuilding our soils, we need to also talk about rebuilding the land base of people of color and restoring the rights of Indigenous people and Black people to be able to grow their own food and build food sovereignty.
Yes. And thank you. That was powerfully said, and so absolutely so important. And as someone who lives on an 80-acre farm, I want to add, we need to invest in the R&D we need to know more about rebuilding the soil and about perennial cereal crops, conserving our topsoil. So I want to say many, many thanks to all the speakers, to Adrien Salazar, Ben Goloff, Tamara, Toles, O'Loughlin, and to everyone who stepped up to ask the incredible, wonderful questions. We couldn't get to all of them. Also, heartfelt gratitude to all of you who volunteered and donated and organized to get Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and other Democratic climate leaders from school board to the White House to a win. The climate crisis demands that we keep going. We have our glass of champagne, and then we keep on going with dedication and an unswerving commitment to uphold just policies and the priorities that are going to get us to a green, sustainable, equitable, and just future. And I'm going to ask you to do something right now toward that future. Please go to the Council's website, dncclimate.org. Sign up for our updates and our calls to action if you haven't already. And volunteer. Help us take control of the Senate by volunteering to help in those two key Georgia Senate races, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff. That election is on January 5th. Make it your pre-New Year's resolution to help. We can tackle the climate crisis together. We can achieve our vision of a green, sustainable future, a future with a just transition for workers and for communities on the front lines, a reparative future, which centers environmental justice. So thank you and good night. Let's go fight the good fight. Let's advocate for these indivisible and beautiful things, climate, racial justice, a sustainable green economy with our hearts and our heads, for people and for planet. Thanks and good night.